Thank you very much for the introduction. Honored to be even perceived as being considered an elder. I'd like to thank our elder who opened the ceremony today. Taz, you noticed she was in the wheelchair. It's the only time I can push her around. But thanks for that beautiful opening ceremony with the smudging and the prayers and the drumming. I'd also like to thank my mother who's here for giving me life. We're talking here about Mother Earth and how Mother Earth nurtures us and gives us life. This is what we're all about today. I'd like to thank the organizing. I sound like I just won an Academy Award. I'd like to thank this will be my last thank you to the organizing committee for bringing me here to share with you some of my thoughts about what's going on around the oil sands development in Fort McMurray. Again, I'm from the Mikisew Cree First Nation in Fort Chipewyan. Anybody know where that is? Do you also know that Fort Chipewyan is the oldest settlement in Alberta? This is where Alberta began. It was first settled by white settlers in 1788, so it's celebrated over 200 years as a continuously inhabited settlement. Our First Nation is the biggest Indigenous First Nation in the Fort McMurray area. There's 5 First Nations there, Cree and Dene. I'm Cree myself. Our population of my First Nation, again, makes up the biggest population in the region. We're downstream from Fort McMurray, downstream from all the oil sands activity. Very sad situation, and throughout the course of my talk today, I'll give you a better sense, I'll give you a better context of some of the threats to this oldest community in Alberta. Hopefully it's not going to be the first to be destroyed by the environmental activity, or the oil sands activity, pardon me, in Fort McMurray. Our people have lived there the way we describe it, since time immemorial. Anthropologists, through their carbon dating of some of the artifacts that they've found in our region, date us our existence there for at least 12,000 years, according to the way they carbon date the artifacts. So let me jump right into the oil sands mining in Fort McMurray. Many of you are probably very familiar with the activity of the oil sands mining in Fort McMurray. Not a day goes by in the media that there isn't some attention being brought to this city. Mining in Fort McMurray has been in existence for about 40 years. It started with 2 companies. Now there's more than 2 handful of companies and this government continues to approve applications like there's no tomorrow. Fort McMurray is considered the economic engine of North America. This is probably where much of the economic activity in this entire continent is occurring the most and the fastest, and similarly the environmental impacts are occurring in unison with them. Greenhouse gas emissions, it's been cited and referenced in the media as the oil sands being the greatest contributor overall in Canada to greenhouse gas emissions. Tailings ponds, this is where the oil sands companies, after going through the refineries in Fort McMurray or their upgrader units, they dump all the residual leftover oil sands that's left over into these huge ponds. Some of you, if you've been to Fort McMurray, you may have seen them. They're so big that they're actually visible by the naked eye from space, and this will give you a good sense of the type of devastation and degradation to the land that we're talking about. If these tailings ponds were treated the same way in the United States, they would be considered illegal according to United States environmental laws. We also have much concern about future liabilities, not only for reclamation, but decommissioning of all this equipment that they utilize to refine or to mine the oil sands. And you know that as First Nations people, as the Indigenous people there, we were there before the settlers came. We were there definitely 40 years ago before all this mining activity took place. And we will be there once the oil sands have been extracted, the resources have been utilized. And so our people, first and foremost, want to ensure that we still have some ability to maintain a subsistence from the land. Reclamation, only a fraction of the land that has been mined, that has been dug up by big shovels and tractors and so on, only a fraction of the lands have been reclaimed. 0% of the land that has been reclaimed has been certified by the Alberta government. Mining oil sands is very intensive as far as using water and non-renewable resources. To make a barrel of crude oil takes anywhere from 3 to 5 barrels of water. And so water, in our estimation, is our greatest challenge in terms of ensuring that the water is made least impactful to our ability to have not only quality drinking water but quantity of drinking water, considering there's multi-billion-dollar projects being approved day after day, and therefore more and more water is required for mining of these activities. One project that just got approved for the duration of the lifetime of their project would require one cubic trillion meters of water, and that's within about a 30-year period. So it's quite devastating. The oil sands, this gives you a context of what some of our challenges in terms of addressing the environmental issues from the Indigenous perspective. The oil sands is a foreign policy subject matter for many countries around the world, including, as you're aware, from the United States and China. Many people speak about the oil sands: Al Gore, George Bush, Dick Cheney, David Suzuki, former Premier Lougheed. And so we know we're dealing with a global issue. It's no more just a Fort McMurray centric issue. It's no more just an Indigenous centric issue. It's become a global phenomenon. And we know that the States has much interest in what's going on there because they invest more than half of the financial investments in the oil sands coming from the United States. And we know that it's of interest to the United States because Dick Cheney, the vice president, was supposed to make a few trips up there. I think the first one happened just before he was supposed to come around when Katrina hit New Orleans, and so he had to cancel his trip. And the second time he was supposed to come, I think he shot his buddy in a hunting accident or something, so he had to cancel his trip there again. So eventually he'll come here. The oil sands is considered the second largest oil reserve in the world. Many people refer to the oil sands as being the Saudi Arabia of North America. Some people, including Murray Smith, who's the ambassador to Alberta, to the Washington, D.C., representing then Premier Klein. I'm not sure with the new Premier whether he's going to change Murray Smith as their ambassador, but he's been referenced as saying that the oil sands in Fort McMurray is probably the biggest reserve, second to, or Saudi Arabia being second to the oil sands in Fort McMurray. Alberta at the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C. did a humongous showcase featuring the oil sands last summer, the July 4th long weekend, which I attended and took some time to lobby the Canadian ambassador Murray Smith, Congress, senators, and anybody else who would listen about the environmental impacts, because the United States is looking at the oil sands as its silver bullet to their energy crisis, saying they no longer need to rely on the Middle East oil, that they're looking at the oil sands as their source, their silver bullet to their answers. And I was going there and saying, well, it may be just as well, but at the same time, these are the impacts, especially on the Indigenous population. So in our estimation, what's going on in Fort McMurray is reminiscent of a gold rush fever. It's almost In the late 1800s, the governments were looking at the Indian people as an impediment to their being able to mine the gold. And today, the gold is the oil sands, and the Indian people are still an impediment. And so they're trying to muzzle us at any point, at any juncture that would act as a barrier or an obstacle to their ability to mine the oil sands. I'll give you one very good example. Where I come from, we're downstream, as I mentioned earlier, from the oil sands activity down the Athabasca River, and we sit on the north side of Lake Athabasca. We have so many problems today, health-wise. There's a Dr. O'Connor, some of you may have heard him, out of Fort McMurray, who's been trying to voice the concerns from my community where he works and has been for many, many years. And he suggested to Alberta and to the government or anybody else who would listen to him that there's disproportionate cancer rates. They're seeing a lot of different blood disorders in the community, and that some kind of study needs to be done. Well, there was a haphazard study done, and again, only to appease the hearings that were going on for one of the major developers that suggested that there was no correlation between the oil sands activity and the high rates of cancers in the community. Again, in our estimation, was done haphazardly and only, again, to appease this hearing that was taking place in Fort McMurray, and at the end of the day, that application was approved. Dr. O'Connor today is being muzzled. The Health Canada, the federal government, has lodged a complaint to the College of Physicians in Alberta, College of Physicians and Surgeons in Alberta, who Dr. O'Connor is accountable to, Health Canada suggesting that Dr. O'Connor is raising unnecessary tension in the community of Fort Chipewyan, and there's unfounded allegations that he's claiming. And our people are saying this is not true. We support Dr. O'Connor 100%, and he should be listened to. And our people and our leadership is also saying we need a study done that is going to give us some certainty if in fact there's no correlation, or if there's a correlation, that something should be done. So Dr. O'Connor has been muzzled. He's no longer able to talk to any media or to anybody about the issues that he's raising in Fort Chipewyan. And in the end, incidentally, the Alberta government, who says, with Iris Evans as the health minister before this election, said that she was very concerned about what's going on up there, and she would do anything to ensure that there's some certainty, that there's no correlation. Well, with the new minister, David Hancock, he suggested he's satisfied with this haphazard study and that it's given them certainty, and that he's no longer interested in looking and exploring and examining this situation anymore. In the end, it leaves our people with hardly any recourse or anybody to go to look at our very grave issues. And I have friends in one family, a mother and two daughters, all died of cancer and blood-related disorders. I have an aunt who's in the hospital right now who's dying from a blood disorder. So you come to Fort Chipewyan, listen to the people's stories. People are not acting erratically or without any foundation. So today we have water that we can't drink. You can't drink the water. Our elders talked today about 15 years ago. You used to be able to scoop a cup of water from the river as you're traveling on a boat and drink it without any consideration or being concerned about environmental contaminants in the water. Today you can't drink it. The fish, we see a lot of deformities in the fish, blisters on the fish. Our people don't eat the fish, and we've been told by the fisheries department that we can only consume one fish a month. So there's a lot of problem. There's been suggestion that there is arsenic 450 times the acceptable rate in the moose meat. And today we're doing sampling, and the Alberta government is coming to our community hopefully in the next month or so to give us the results of those sampling studies that they've done at the moose meat. If in fact there is arsenic that much times the acceptable rate in the moose meat, well, I think then that really considers that some closer examination of the environmental contamination from the oil sands activity in our region. Almost done. I used to be a chief previously, and they know me being very notorious for being long-winded, so I'm on my last page. And my mom's here too, so I don't want her to be standing up too long. So, what are some of our very current issues? And I'll conclude with some of our current issues. The Athabasca River has been utilized for water to produce the oil sands for the last 40 years. Today, we can't barge any of our staples up from Fort McMurray to Fort Chipewyan because there's no road to Fort Chipewyan. You can only fly in or go on the river by boat. The water's been so low that we can't transport any of our very staple supplies. Hunters and trappers today talk about how they can't access their trap lines anymore because the water is so low that they can only go so far, then they have to walk so many miles. The snow levels today are much lower. There's much less snow today, and I think it's pretty a common issue anywhere you look in Canada. Our elders and hunters and trappers have recognized there's a change in the migration of the birds, the geese and the ducks, and of course the warming temperatures. We have a winter road through from Fort McMurray to Fort Chipewyan that goes over ice roads and so on. Some years we can only use it 3 weeks out of usual 3 months. 15 years ago we'd have a full 3 months solid use of that road. Today, because it's so warm, sometimes some years, like in 1996, just 10 years ago, we had to, the Alberta government had to declare a state of emergency in Fort Chipewyan because we couldn't use the road. It was too warm, the roads couldn't, the ice bridges weren't frozen enough and so on. So these are just some of the examples that we're experiencing and that we're seeing today. There's a threat, of course, to the Athabasca River, the ecologies, the boreal forest, the Peace Athabasca Delta, one of the biggest world-renowned deltas that sees all kinds of birds coming to this delta, is also being threatened by the Athabasca tar sands. And of course, our very people who live in the community, our lives are being threatened, not only because of the cancers and the blood disorders, but our very lifestyle, our traditions, our culture, our ability to sustain ourselves off the land. So we're seeing very much, in our estimation, a very gross negligence by this government, by developers who are collaborating with government to mine the oil sands, and anybody else who's attempting to muzzle anybody who wants to make a difference in terms of what's going on there, to attempt to ensure that what's going on there is done in a way that is mindful of the environment, not only the human health but the animal health as well, but the ecologies that are going to sustain our people for generations to come. Very gross negligence on the part of the Alberta government, the developers, and even the Canadian government, who's responsible for health services to Indigenous people in this country. The very people who lodged a complaint against a doctor who was making some noises about what's actually happening up there. So I'm going to end there and just say that, yes, as Indigenous people who live downstream from all this activity are very concerned about what's going on, not only to our health, our physical health, but to the animal health, to the land, global warming, climate change, and so on. So it's no longer just an Indigenous-centric issue. It's no longer just a Fort McMurray issue. It's a global issue. It's an Albertan issue. So I'm glad to see so many people here. And I think it's about time that people who are involved in the environmental movement and the Indigenous people have come together, and I think it's natural that we come together because our values and our philosophies are aligned about being considered, about the environment, and so on and so forth. So thank you all very much.